Hi everyone, Stepan here. Today I'm going to talk about knight and bishop imbalances in the endgame. In my experience, practical experience, this is the most interesting and important type of endgame for the tournament player. And to prove that, I'm going to show you 4 of my games. One of them I won, it's this one, you can see on the screen, and the other 3 I lost. And then I'm also going to show you 2 games, one lost by Magnus Carlsen and one won by Anatoly Karpov. I'm going to try to highlight when the bishop is good versus when the knight is good. You can see some general rules on the screen, and this is, I've managed to select 5 what I think are most important rules from many endgame books I've read. So I'm going to try to focus on how to navigate knight versus bishop endgames in practical play. So to start with, I'm going to show you my best result ever, my highest rated win. I was playing against Goran Antunac, who is an IM, close to 2400 at the time. And I had white in this position. Obviously, I'm up 2 pawns, but it's not trivial at all. So in this case, the knight is much better than the bishop, not just because white has extra pawns, although that's what makes the position winning, but because the knight can very effectively isolate all the entry points for the black king and dominate the king. That's something that the bishop is simply unable to do. And the way I won this endgame was, I think, very instructive. So king f1, bishop c5, fine, king e2, king f8, and f4. And what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to get all of my pawns going, and I want to play g4 and I want to play f5, get the pawns to light squares so that this bishop doesn't have access to h2 and just picks up all the pawns. And what I'm trying to do is I want to blockade all the entry points for the black king to enter the position, and later on I'm going to do that with my knight. So basically create a barrier with the pawn on c4, or the pawn on c5 and the other pawn on c4, and with the knight to make sure the king cannot cause any trouble. The only source of counterplay for black is the a pawn, of course. For the moment it's been, prevented from moving, but this king is going to march its way to d7 at some point, and at which point I need to be able to get within the square of this pawn. For now, of course, my king is within the square, and I need to be able to control the pawn. Unless black does something with the pawn, I'm not going to lose. So let me show you what happened very quickly. I centralized my king, got closer to the a pawn, pushed my pawns to light squares, and now I started this process of transferring the knight to c1. That may seem strange, but what I want to do is knight b3, c1, d3. That way my knight controls the c5 square, the c4 pawn controls b5 and d5, and the black king has no way into the position. If the black king has no way into the position, then black can never do anything. So this is a very nice example of how a knight can be better than the bishop. So h5, of course, black would like to exchange pawns and fight for a draw. I don't really mind that. Knight b3, ag, ag, a4, okay, knight c1, my knight's coming to d3, bishop a5 check, and knight d3. And at this point I knew that the game was over. My knight is perfectly placed, the king is never crossing any of these squares, therefore I can just safely queen my kingside pawns and even march my king down to the kingside once I've eliminated the a pawn. So what I did next was I pushed my pawn to f6. That means that the king cannot exit the square of the f pawn, because if it does, I'm just going to go e6 and f7 and f8 queen. So either the king or the bishop now need to babysit the f6 pawn. On the other hand, this pawn is still immune because black can never, trade knights. The knight's on a light square. So king d7, and now c5 was the final idea. I want to push my pawn to c4, create the next barrier, and now this pawn is defenseless. King c6. c4, of course, and needless to say that, bishop takes c5, knight c5, king c5, e6, fe6, f7 is losing for black. I'm just going to queen my pawn. That was the whole point behind f6. That way I could push my pawn to c5 and never worry about losing it because it's immune. Bishop h6 was played. I picked up the a-pawn, and now it's just a simple case of bringing my king over here or over here and winning the game. So after bishop d2, king b3, bishop g5, king c2, my opponent resigned. The best way to learn any type of endgame and anything in chess basically is to find a sparring partner, play it out against them. And I've had my biggest successes after not really having a coach, but having a training partner and playing out critical positions I would often get wrong against them. And in the absence of a crazy person who wants to play chess all the time, I use Nocti and their feature called Themes, where you can basically set up any position you want and practice it against a human like AI, which is as close you can get to having a human sparring partner. As you can see here, I have a million themes. So this is my game against Željko Bedić, my game against Bena Matic, my game against FIDE master Lovro Čupić, the Ding Ukesh game, my prep for Ilić. So basically anything I'm trying to get better at, I'm going to do it using Nocti's themes. And I did the same for this knight and bishop video. I've set up 4 positions, 4 critical positions from the 4 games I played you're about to see in the video. And what you can do if you follow the link in the description below, you can play them out against Nocti. You can of course create your own themes and play out your own positions, but this is what I did to get better at the endgames I lost. So my game against Mrkonjić, dead draw, I lost it. Maximenko, dead draw, I lost it. Petricevic, dead draw, I lost that endgame. So what I do is I go to this position and I play it out against Nocti. You can select Nocti's difficulty, of course. I set it to be about 2300 FIDE, and then I played it out for 20 times until I got it right every time. That's how you get better. So follow the link in the description. If you decide to go premium and Nocti, use the code Hanging Pawns to get a massive 64% discount. Let's get back to the video. Now this was an extreme example because I was up material. Now I'm going to show you a game from the same tournament. Both were played in the 2021 Croatian League, Croatian First League. And in this game I'm playing Nenad Mrkonjić, who is another international master, 2350. It's a dead even endgame. In this case I have the bishop. And this bishop is very poorly placed. The only thing I have going for myself is these 2 pawns on g3 and h4. So if I ever manage to play, bishop c7, which I did play here, my opponent must react with f4. But this did happen in the game, and what do I do from here? My bishop is dominated by my pawn on b6, by my pawn on a5. This knight has the square on b5 to play with, and what you have to do in all knight and bishop endgames, as is the case with rook endgames and every other type of endgame, you need to calculate the king and pawn endgame precisely. So whether I can trade bishop for knight or not depends on whether the king and pawn endgame is winning, losing, or drawn. So okay, I have no way to make progress after f4. My opponent does. So here's the thing. In conjunction with the imbalance between the 2 pieces, who controls the pawn breaks becomes very important. So I can play f6 and either g5 or e5, but that needs to be prepared, so I played king e7. My opponent can play e4 straight away, so he did. Now, pause the video. What should black do? I lost the game immediately. So, the thing is, if we trade knight for bishop in the pawn structure that I got after playing king d6, I'm completely losing. I did not see the winning plan, my opponent did see it, and he beat me a couple of moves later. So I played king d6, my opponent took on d5, I took on d5, he played knight b5, and at the time I thought, okay, this is fine. But after knight takes, king takes, white has only one winning move, and it's fairly simple in hindsight. f5, and black resigns. So I played on a few more moves, king d6, king d3, king e7, bishop f4, king f6, g4, and this was the end of the game. This is a winning king and pawn endgame. So hg, king g7, king g5, f6, king h6, fg, and of course, there is no hope. I need to go king h6, king f5, king h5, king f6, and my king is too far away. So what should I have done? This is a drawn endgame. However, the knight's much better than the bishop because of everything we said earlier. So the way to draw this was actually to play d4, because now on knight takes e4, the endgames, the king and pawn endgames, are not losing. I can go bishop d6. Obviously f5 doesn't work. And this entry point, which is what I was actually worried about, is fine. I'm controlling it. For example, knight d6, king c4, something, king b5, king c7. There's nothing here. b4, ab, king b, drawn king and pawn endgame. The same idea doesn't work, of course, because now I'm able to go king c6. So the way h5 worked on the other side of the board, a5 would win for black here. For example, a5 takes, and now I'm quicker. So this is a draw. At this point, white wouldn't have any way to make progress, and the game would be drawn. This doesn't really do anything. I can go king d6, d7, c7. When the king reaches b5, I can just defend, and same story all over again. So I lost that endgame. Let's look at another one. So this is the Belgrade Open 2021 again, I think. I'm playing Viktor Maximenko, another international master, 22-39. Obviously, the endgame is drawn. I'm sorry, there's construction going on, and it's about 37 degrees in Zagreb today. So it's obviously a drawn endgame. But how do you draw the endgame? So obviously, the only way I can lose is if the white king or if the white bishop win this pawn. So I played knight c7. My opponent played bishop d6, and I should not trade knight for bishop. Obviously, the king and pawn endgame is losing. Even if my king was on d7, I would have to move the knight because my opponent has a winning king and pawn endgame. So I need to move my knight. And I managed to lose the game in one move once again. I'm choosing very extreme positions to highlight when each piece is better. So what I need to do here is I need to play either knight d5 or knight b5 or knight e6. I need to keep my knight active. For example, knight d5 check, king e4, king e6. Very active, no entry points. If, I don't know, let's say bishop b8, knight e7, king f4, king f7, the king comes into, let's say the king comes here. I can now go knight c6. The bishop moves away. I can go knight d4. I'm going to check the king away. As long as I'm preventing this and this, I'm going to be fine. What I did in the game is absolutely appalling. In my defense, we were both under a minute, and when you're defending, well, that sucks. I played knight e8, losing the game on the spot. Why is this losing? It illustrates the very obvious example of how a bishop dominates the knight. I had decided to dominate my own knight. Look at the bishop. My knight has no moves. I'm in absolute zugzwang. My opponent played king f4 and I can resign. King e6, fine, king g5, and that's it. That's the end of the game. King f7, king f5. No more moves. No more moves. My only move is king g8. Only move. And now the king enters the position, and the game is losing. Why is the game losing? Well, I don't know. King h8, king f7, knight f6, ef6, and that's it. Unfortunately, if this was a light-squared bishop, I'd be able to take, and this is a dead draw, but it's not. It's the correct corner. So I lost by dominating my own knight. So another principle that I didn't really want to put on the screen because it's not as important is a bishop can dominate a knight, but a knight cannot dominate a bishop, or at least not as often. Now, Hvar Open 2022, I'm playing a lower rated player, 1900. I have the bishop in this position. So, who would you say is better here? Try to have a little think about this position. What you can see on the screen is that asymmetrical structures favor the bishop. So, in theory, I should be better here. And as we're going to see in the next two examples, in this pawn structure, the bishop had dominated the knight. However, it's not as simple as that. If you put black's king on f7 and pawns on e7, g6, g7 and f6, then white would be very close to winning. However, these pawns are far advanced, they are controlling a ton of squares, and black's king is extremely active. So, once again, and I know I'm taking extreme examples, I lost the game in one move. What would you do here? There is only one way to stay equal. To stay equal, not to be better. I played bishop f3, thinking, well, you know, if e4 comes, what am I going to do? My bishop's going to be stuck all the way on the queen side. And I'm going to show you what happened in the game. What I should have done, and the only move to keep things equal, is f3. Why? Well, it's preventing e4, first of all. Secondly, knight f4 does nothing. If knight f4, I go g3, knight h5, g4, we trade, knight f6 trying to win my pawn, g5, knight h7 trying to win my pawn, bishop e4, draw, dead draw. Instead, I played bishop f3, and I believe this is one of the most devastating defeats I've ever had. The Hvar Open started really well for me. I won against, you know, a low-rated player. Then I drew an IM, and you know, I was having a good tournament. But playing bishop f3 here and realizing that I'm losing immediately after e4 was devastating. I knew that I was losing here. As you can see on the screen, a bishop is very bad when it's stuck behind pawns on its own color, and it doesn't have to be your own pawns. They don't have to be your own pawns. It's even worse when it's your opponent's pawns. What my students and many beginner players often think is that your opponent should have pawns on dark squares when you have a light squared bishop, because that way you cannot target the pawns. That's absolutely wrong. When you have a light squared bishop and your opponent has a knight, he needs the pawns on dark squares. Why? Because the pawns control the light squares, the knight controls the dark squares, and it's perfect harmony. My bishop is stuck. So this is losing for white, and I knew it was losing. Bishop d1, knight f4, g3, knight d3, game over. There's a lamp next to me, if you can see it, because Lucia's brother is an architect, and this was his room when he was staying with their grandmother. So, yeah. In any case, this is resigns, of course, knight takes f2, and I lost a couple of moves later. So I think this is a great example, same as my knight e8 blunder in the game against Viktor Maximenko, how you can lose the game that's drawn if you don't understand the simple strategy in these endgames. And as you're going to see in the games from my recent tournament, I actually had two bishops of the same color endgames that I managed to mess up or misassess in a very different way. So I'm gonna do that video very soon. But knight and bishop, as you can see, I have a win in a clearly winning position, and I had 3 losses from equal positions. So the game against Petricevic, Maximenko, and Mrkonjic, all 3 were dead draws. The engine says 0-0. A good player would have drawn them, you know, very simply. I lost all 3. And I like to think of myself as a relatively educated chess player. That couldn't have been more wrong at the time. So in this case, f3 draw. Now I'm going to show you 2 endgames where the bishop clearly dominates the knight. If we have a look at this endgame, the beginning of this endgame against Petricevic that I shown you a second ago, if we compare it to this endgame, it's clear that they are similar. However, in this case, black has no advanced pawns. White's pawn structure is intact. It's therefore very hard for black to do anything to create any weaknesses, and white's king is very active. Black's pawns have created weaknesses. there's a target on b7, and there are entry points into the position for the white king here. So this was played in 2004 in the World Cup. Asymmetrical had white against Magnus Carlsen. King c3 by white, knight c7, king c4, b6, okay, has to defend the pawn, a4, and now the plan is simple. a5, weakening the pawn. It's clear that this is winning for white. There's no way to prevent a5. If black plays a5, then the knight is stuck. Black played a5, but now the knight can never move because the king comes in either here or here. f4, dominating the king. King g7, g4, dominating the king again, h4, dominating the king, bishop e4. What can you do as black? Black played king g7, bishop c6, dominates the knight. I think after bishop c6, white may wish to play bishop d7 in some cases, but after king f6, he plays bishop back to f3, bishop e4, forcing the king to keep defending the pawn. There's no rush here for white at all. And at some point, white wants to enter d4 with the king. He played g5 here, forcing the king further back, bishop d3, king e4, and now the king is coming in. Of course, you don't want to trade. If you do trade, it's still a winning endgame. If, I don't know, let's say here, it's still winning because the white's just going to pick up all the pawns, but it's safer to keep the bishop on the board. Now, of course, your king is coming into d4. Takes, h takes. I don't know, king f8 was played by black, and now king e5, and that's the end. Magnus Carlsen played king f7, bishop e4, king g7, king d6, c4, king c7, knight a2, king b6, and here he resigned. So in the starting position, I'm sorry, my Lichess tab keeps moving. In the starting position, it's very, very clear why white is better. So this is a very simple example. Now let's look at another one. Karpov versus Susan Polgar. Evaluate the position. Pause the video, evaluate the position. It's, again, fairly similar to the previous one, but there's a major difference. The major difference between this position and the Asymmetrical-Carlsen game is that neither side has a passed pawn. In this position, white had 3-2 on the king side, black had 3-2 on the queen side, and the bishop, being able to defend and attack at the same time, was able to outplay the knight. In this case, white does not have a passed pawn on the king side, but it's still completely winning. Why? Because the knight is bad at covering both sides of the board. King f3 by Karpov, king e4, a4, this cannot be taken, the pawn cannot advance. If it's taken, we take on a6 and then play bishop b5, so has to defend, ab, f4, the pawns are going to cover the dark squares, the bishop's going to cover the light squares. Karpov is not in a hurry, takes, the bishop dominates the king enters f5, and the game is basically over. I mean, g5 played by Polgar, but after king g6 it's clear that the game is losing. King takes pawn, king f6, bishop d7, and now what Karpov's trying to do, he's trying to dominate the knight. Look at the knight. The knight has no squares. Black can only move the king. Played king e7, but Karpov, being Karpov, calculates correctly and just sacks the bishop, and of course 3 pawns against the knight. Pawns on the h file and the b file was game over very quickly. The knight is completely helpless. Not that bishop takes was the best move. Maybe it was according to the engine, but he could have won with bishop h3 or bishop f5 or whatever else. It's winning 100 different ways. This is just cleaner. So I wanted to show you these games, and what you should try to do is select your own games where you had bishop against knight. Select them and try to see whether you messed them up. I did. I've shown you 4 endgames. There were more than 4. But these are the most drastic examples, especially my 3 losses. So yeah, I hope you got something from this. Let me know what you think. If you have any questions, ask them in the comments. See you soon. And I hope it's not as hot where you're at. Bye-bye.